Well, if you're a fan of college football, some of you are, some of you are not, but even if you're not, listen to this. This might nevertheless resonate with you. But if you're a fan, then you may know that one of the Power Five conferences in football, the big conferences, the ones that make a lot of money. We're talking about, more money than we can imagine. So one of those is a Big 12, and this week the Big 12 voted to invite four new universities to join their conference. Now, one of those schools that was invited was the University of Houston. But that almost didn't happen. I read an article this week, actually came out yesterday in the Houston Chronicle, that detailed how that invitation came about. Even though initially U of H was going to be left out of this process. And they've had to deal with that for years, where they're trying to get into the Big 12 or some other big conference. Big 12 is the most obvious because it just means so much more money and prestige and recognition. And they're always left out. Nobody wants them. And it almost happened again this time. But they were finally invited, and it had to do, this article in the Houston Chronicle detailed how the invitation came about, and it had to do with a man who's a billionaire. He owns the Houston Rockets, and he's chairman of the Board of Regents for U of H, the University of Houston. His name is Tillman Fertitta. And this man, when he heard, he's a big power broker, as it were. When he heard that the Big 12 conference was not going to invite their school to join them, he heard this from the athletic director. See, the athletic director only had so much power to make this happen. When it didn't happen, he went to the billionaire and he said, look, we're not going to get invited. So this man got on the phone and he started to use his leverage. Long story short, they got the invitation. They're going to be part of the Big 12 conference within the next couple of years. And this means a lot of positive changes for U of H, not the least of which, like I said, is a lot more money, a lot of money. But when I read this article, here's the way the article ended. On this story. The Big 12 was going to say no to U of H again. Then U of H was finally in. This was personal for Fertitta. He's a billionaire man. This was personal because this was business. This was his legacy. Now, the word legacy gets thrown around a lot, especially in politics. Politicians, for sure, the media pundits, the talking heads talk about how politicians make decisions based on what they want their legacy to be. In fact, President George H.W. Bush even admitted this in his memoirs. He described this whole process of making decisions based on, with an eye toward their legacy, what it might be when they're gone. He called it the L word, like if it's some bad word, the L word, legacy. Well, today we're concluding our sermon series in the book of Philemon. This series has been titled Changed. The first week we talked about a changed life, the life of Onesimus. The second week we talked about a changed perspective. Paul was writing to Philemon and encouraging him to take a new view on Philemon. Today we're going to talk about a changed legacy. And just as a matter of review, this letter from Paul to Philemon is a personal appeal of Paul to Philemon. Philemon was a wealthy man. He was a Christian. He was a slave owner. We talked about how that fits in to Christianity. It really doesn't, but it explained how, in the first week I explained how being or owning slaves was really a reality of the economics of the time and even the social reality. So be that what it may, Philemon was a slave owner, and one of his slaves was Onesimus. Onesimus ran away from him. He wronged him. We don't know exactly what he did. He might have stolen something from him. He might have damaged some of his property. Whatever it was he did, after he did that, he ran away from his master, Philemon. And he went to Rome, and while he was in Rome, he met Paul. Paul was in prison at the time, but he met Paul. Paul led him to the Lord. He became a Christian. And so now Paul is writing to Philemon. Paul encouraged Onesimus, go back to your master. Well, I'm sure Onesimus didn't want to do that because that would have meant he would have been punished. They were very harsh with runaway slaves. He could have even been killed. Yet Paul encouraged him, go back, be reconciled with Philemon. And then he wrote a letter to Philemon, which Onesimus delivered. Wrote a letter to Philemon, and he asked him to receive Onesimus as a brother in Christ. Now, this is huge because he wasn't just asking him, forgive him, take him back as a slave, let bygones be bygones. That would have been shocking enough if Philemon had just taken him back as a slave without punishing him. But he's not only saying, don't punish him, don't take him back as a slave, receive him as your equal. Now, that's unheard of. Receive him as your equal, receive him as your brother. So Paul was making a huge request in this letter. We've been going through the letter, and I want to start today from Philemon, verse 17. So turn in your Bibles to Philemon. It's a short enough verse that it doesn't need to be broken up into chapters. It's only verses. So it's Philemon, verse 17. I think I said 11. Verse 17. Philemon 17, this is what Paul writes. So, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. Now, what does that mean? Well, Paul had been dictating this letter. But at this point, he takes the pen himself and he writes this part. So important. It's so important. He writes this part with his own hand. So he says, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. I do wish, brother, that I may have some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. Confident of your obedience, I write to you knowing that you will do even more than I ask. So, I want to talk about legacy today. What is legacy? What is legacy? Today is Grandparents' Day, and we honor our grandparents. And your grandparents, at least for myself and my wife, because we talk about this, we're at the age where we talk about what will we be remembered for? What will our legacy be? Now, some dictionaries, and I looked up the word, and I looked up several dictionaries, several sources, looked up the word legacy, and most of the definitions have to do with leaving an inheritance, a financial inheritance or a property, that type of thing. I think of legacy a little bit different, and here's my working definition of legacy. Legacy is what remains in the minds of others about who we were after we're gone. Legacy is what remains in the minds of others about who we were. Legacy is a sum of all we are and how we lived that impacts others when we're gone. And when we're gone doesn't mean that after we died. We might move from one situation to another situation, and we've left a legacy. The way we lived, the way we acted, maybe continues to impact others in their minds. I really hesitate to say this, but I will, and I hope that you understand that I say it in the humblest of ways. But I heard. I had a conversation on Facebook Messenger with a former student of mine, way back from when I taught at Edison. Somebody I hadn't really thought of or connected with, for years. She had reached out to me earlier, and I hadn't seen the message until recently. So we had a conversation, and she was very very clear. She said to several times. She said something to me. Something like, you don't know this, but you really impacted my life. And honestly, I didn't know that. She was one of many students that I had. 1 year I had 250 students. I was teaching by myself, and so many kids, huge classes. But she said something interesting to me. She said, I would be out in the hallway working on doing some work from another class, and you would walk by and you stop and talk to me. You really made a difference, I thought. Just because I talked to you? And of course, I didn't know this, but she had a really difficult childhood, and she's doing well. And I felt good to hear that she was doing so well. But that's what I'm talking about. What do people think about you way after you're gone from that setting, or maybe when you're gone from this life? Something that impacts them, something that makes them say, wow, you really made a difference in my life. Now, for every one of those kids, there's some who probably weren't happy, that I was a part of their lives. But many people are interested in leaving an inheritance, and there's nothing wrong with that, but an inheritance is not enough. An inheritance without a legacy, or an inheritance with the wrong legacy, is going to lead to problems. It leads to problems among the remaining children if it's the parents that are gone. Building the right legacy is intentional, and it's something that takes place over time. But I think we can learn today. We can learn to build the right legacy from Paul, from the way he treated Onesimus, the way that he wrote to Philemon. Our lives, what I'm trying to say is that our lives have the potential to profoundly influence and inspire others long after we're gone. They have that potential. Your life has that potential. Our legacy has the ability to generate change even after we're gone. If we do things right, if we do things well, if we do things God's way. You don't want people to be saying, after you're gone from the situation or after you die, you don't want people to be saying, man, I don't know, I tried really hard. I remember hearing this lady, she was divorced and she was left with young children, and she was talking about her husband, and she was like, he just didn't do it right. He just didn't do it right. And knowing the family, of course, that was just one side of the situation, but knowing the family, I thought there could be some truth to this, her side of the story. You don't want people shaking their heads when they think about you. You want to leave the right legacy. So Paul's letter to Philemon isn't just about a changed life, as we've been talking about. It's about a changed history and a changed legacy. This letter is so important. I said, don't sleep on the fact that it's short. It's a minor letter. No, it's so important. This letter changed history. It changed history. And I'm going to tell you how. You may be wondering, because this is not in the letter. We haven't talked about this, that you might be wondering that what happened to Onesimus? Did Philemon forgive him? Did he have him killed? Did he take him back as a slave? Did he take him back as a brother? What happened? Well, we don't know from the letter, but we have some scholarly speculation. Okay, this is some very educated men that have speculated, scholars that have speculated, and this is what most scholars believe happened. Now, not everybody's in agreement. I read several sources, and there were some like, no, that couldn't have happened. Because if this had happened, Onesimus would have been 90 years old. No, it could have happened. But the majority of them say, yeah, this is probably, nobody can say for sure. It's like I said, a scholarly speculation. This is what most scholars believe to be the case. Many years after this letter was written by Paul to Philemon, another letter was written by a man named Ignatius. Ignatius was one of the early church fathers. And Ignatius wrote a letter to the churches in Ephesus. And in this letter, he wrote about a pastor in Ephesus. Let me give you a little background about Ephesus. The church in Ephesus was one of the most influential and powerful churches in the first century. Some of you may know that in Ephesus was the temple of Diana. Diana was, among other things, was considered the goddess of sex. She was considered the goddess of childbirth and other things, but primarily the goddess of sex. Now, the temple of Diana, later called Artemis, was in Ephesus. the goddess of sex, and it was the most perverted, disgusting, vile type of sex you could ever imagine. So this, you can imagine that the temple being there, being so important, so prominent in society, this worship of goddess was destroying the very moral and spiritual fiber of society at that time. But the church in Ephesus grew to be such a strong church, strong Christians. It got to be so influential and so powerful that under the leadership of the pastor at Ephesus, this church shut down the temple of Diana and completely changed the spiritual climate of the city. It was a great thing that they did. Now, take a wild guess what the name of the pastor of Ephesus was. His name was Onesimus. Onesimus. Now, was this the same Onesimus? This is where the scholars don't 100% agree, but most of them think that it was the same Onesimus. And one of the reasons they think it was the same one, because when Ignatius wrote this letter to the church in Ephesus, and he mentions Onesimus, the pastor of Ephesus, he used some terminology that Paul used. When he's writing about Onesimus, he talks about how Onesimus used to be useless, but now he's useful. Remember we talked about that the first week? Paul was playing on words there because the word Onesimus means useful. So when Paul wrote to Philemon, he said Onesimus was formerly useless to you, but now he's useful to you and to me. And Ignatius, in writing about this Onesimus, said the same thing. He formerly was useless, now he's useful, leading scholars to believe that Ignatius was aware of the letter that Paul had written to Philemon. Now here's what else we know about Ephesus. It was in Ephesus that all of Paul's letters were assembled. They were put together there in Ephesus. And scholars speculate that there was a pastor in Ephesus that argued for certain letters to be included in the biblical canon, to be included in the Bible. And this pastor in Ephesus specifically wanted the letter to Philemon to be included in the biblical canon. So, that's a real possibility. And if that's the case, if we agree with the majority of scholars, then the letter to Philemon changed history, because it changed not only Philemon by apparently him receiving Onesimus, but it changed Onesimus, and look where he got to be. He got to be the pastor of a church that turned the city around. Let me ask you a question. I want you to think about your life and think about where you are right now. And as you think about your life, trace back the events that led you to where you are right now. You're sitting here. This is September the 12th, 2021. You're sitting here in a gathering, worship gathering. Some of you are watching online. You're watching this sermon either live or maybe the replay. Some of you might be listening, through your earbuds on a podcast later this week, or whatever the case might be. But think about where you are right now, and think about the events that brought you to this place. How did you end up here? Who had influence in your life? Who did God use in your life? Certainly your parents, but maybe somebody else who invited you to come here, or somebody else who taught you how to discern spiritual things and you had a desire to draw close to God. God used somebody to influence you, to shape you, and to bring you where you are right now. I mentioned earlier, this is Grandparents' Day. For a lot of us, it was our grandparents. Maybe for you, it's your grandparents that shaped, maybe by shaping your parents' lives, who then shaped your lives, and you're here following the Lord. And the other question is this, and I hate, sorry to be so, I'm not trying to be dark or anything, but if you were to die today, what would your legacy be? Now, you might say, well, I'm too young to have a legacy. If I die today and I'm only in my 20s, I'm not going to have a legacy. You will. You will. Several years ago now, how many of you remember when Aaron Allen was killed in a car crash? Ruth's son, Susan's nephew, and how shocking that was. A young man, not even in his 20s, I don't think. It's been a few years, but he was killed. And of course, I had the opportunity to preach that funeral, to officiate that funeral, and hundreds of people that were there, a lot of students. If you were there, you remember just a lot of his friends. He left a legacy. He left a legacy. I haven't been to Chili's lately, but the last time I went to Chili's, they still have his picture. They still had his picture up there. He left a legacy. He was, I think, just 19 years old. He left a legacy. So you might think, well, I'm not going to leave a legacy. Yeah, you will. People will remember you. And so my question is, if your legacy is not all that great, again, you don't want to be the kind of person that people are shaking their heads and talking about. You're like, well, too bad. He just didn't do it right. If that's your legacy, if that will be your legacy, then we need to ask God, change my legacy, change my life, and change my legacy. Now, here's how we can do that. Some things we learned from Paul. Number one, learn to believe in people. Learn to believe in people. We tend to be skeptical about people. We doubt their motives, right? We doubt their motives, especially if they vote differently than we do. They have different political ideologies. That's huge right now. Then we're skeptical. We tend to gravitate toward people who live like us, who believe like us, who vote like us, people who think like us. But I think there has to be something greater in us. There must be something greater within us that will move us past those moments of cynicism and skepticism to help us to see the value in people, the potential in people. We've got to learn to believe in people. You know, when I was young, I had a very limited view and a very limited understanding of what it was to be a Christian. My view was shaped by the bubble in which I lived. And we all live in bubbles to a certain extent, right? Growing up, we had our bubbles. And my bubble growing up was church, not just church, but Pentecostal church. Not just Pentecostal church, but Assemblies of God. I mean, that was my bubble. That's all I knew. And when I was a kid, I remember that I used to judge everybody else based on my experience in my bubble as a Christian. And what I mean by that is if I would hear that so-and-so may be a football player, so-and-so is a Christian, then in my mind, I was a kid, but in my mind I would think, oh, that means he goes to church, he goes to Sunday school, church twice on Sunday, he speaks in tongues. Everything was judged on what I knew. My understanding was limited by what I knew. And I was a kid, but even when I got to be a teenager, I still believe that way. If I heard a movie star was a Christian, then in my mind, he was Assemblies of God. He had to be. If you're going to be a Christian, you can't be anything else, right? That was my limited understanding. And in fact, when I went to college, I went to Bible school at Southwestern, SAGU. Back then it was SAGC. It was a college. Now it's university. And God began to expand my understanding of the Christian faith. I went to, this is in the 70s, went to Bible school and found out that the kids there went to the movies. I was like, oh, no, you can't do that. You're Christians. You're Assemblies of God. I can go to the movies. They went to the movies. I couldn't believe it. Superman was out. Back, I think it was 79. Superman was out. And they're talking about, Superman was like, what are you doing? We should be talking about the Bible, right? So, and then, in my other college settings and my first jobs, God was expanding my understanding of the Christian faith to help me see that there are other expressions of the Christian faith that are very different from mine. They're still biblical. They're very much valued and valuable, but I had to learn to believe in other people that were different than me, who had different faith traditions than me. And now, Paul could have remained skeptical about Onesimus. Oh, yes, I know I led you to the Lord, but he might have been thinking, he's a thief. He stole from Philemon. What's to keep him from stealing from me? He could have said that, right? Onesimus could have been the same way. He could have been skeptical about Paul. He wants me to go back to Philemon? I think I know the way this movie ends. I end up back as a slave or in jail or beheaded. But he didn't. Neither Paul nor Onesimus treated each other that way. They believed in each other. Look at verse 10, Philemon 10. I appeal to you. This is Paul writing to Philemon about Onesimus. I appeal to you. This is the New Living Translation, by the way. I appeal to you to show kindness to my child Onesimus. I became his father in the faith while here in prison. He's asking, be kind to Onesimus. Be kind to him. So my question to you is, as you review your life, what man or woman believed in you? As you trace the events that led you to where you are now, was there a school teacher? Was there a supervisor at work? Was there a church leader or a friend at church? Who did God use to shape your life because they believed in you? They thought, yeah, I know you can do this. Now, the master of them all, of course, is Jesus, right? Jesus, who chose the most unlikely people and told them to go preach the gospel to every creature, to every person. He didn't choose religious leaders, educated. They were educated, they were articulate. No, he chose a tax collector, which people hated. He chose some fishermen, which, that was a blue-collar job, but they weren't too highly respected. So Jesus believes in you. He believes in you. Now, here's the thing. And the reason I say is learn to believe in people, because it's something we've got to learn to do. Every one of you, as I look across here, every one of you that is here, I believe in you. I believe in you. It's not hard, though. It's not hard for me to believe in you. Believe that you can do great things. And you believe in each other here. But just step out of this location and go somewhere else with coworkers and other people that, like I said, don't move in the same circles we do. Don't believe like we do about the value of unborn life. They don't. We believe, that unborn life is of God. It's valuable, but others don't. Can you still believe in them in a way that makes an impact on them and maybe opens them up to your influence and your guidance? Yeah, believing in each other here is easy. Jesus didn't pick the easy part. He picked the people that others were rejecting. He says, I believe in you. You're my disciples. Go change the world. And Jesus believes in you right now because you bear the image of God, every one of you. And he wants you to believe in other people who also bear the image of God. I love this quote. I read this about 4 years ago, and I've saved it, and I share it from time to time. It's from an article that journalist Janie B. Chaney wrote in World Magazine. She wrote this: don't forget that political opponents are image bearers of a holy God. They're image bearers of a holy God. Believe in them. Don't mock them. Don't make fun of them because they're making wrong decisions. And don't do it on social media. If you do, don't tell them you're from Solid Rock. Don't, because they bear the image of God, and Jesus believes in you because you bear his image, and he wants you to believe in others that also bear his image. So learn to believe in people. Then finally, learn to take risks on people. Learn to take risks on people. Let's read Philemon 17 again. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand, and here's what's so important, he had to write it with his own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. Now, Paul put his name, his reputation, and his resources on somebody else who previously had been useless, previously had been a thief or in some other manner had damaged Philemon's property. But this was so important, as I said, that Paul wrote it in his own hand. He didn't want any doubt. He didn't want for there to be any doubt as to what he was doing here. This was too important to be doubted, too important to be second-guessed, too important to be misunderstood. He says it very clearly, if he has wronged you, if he owes you anything, charge it to me. I'll pay it. I'll pay it back. Whatever he's done that's wrong, I'll take care of it. However he's wronged you, I'll take care of it. Now, I want you to notice something here. This is the only one of Paul's letters in which he doesn't mention the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is the only one of Paul's letters in which he doesn't mention the gospel. And he doesn't mention the gospel because he doesn't have to mention it explicitly, because he's living it out. He's living out the gospel. Now, Paul here is acting like Christ. He is a type of Christ to Onesimus, in that Paul pays the cost for Onesimus to be accepted again as a brother. He knew it might not work out. He knew that Onesimus might change his mind, or Philemon, maybe would still not receive him as a brother. But he was willing to pay the cost, to pay the price for Onesimus to be accepted as a brother. So he doesn't mention it explicitly, but he's living out the gospel. He's saying, here is how you live the gospel. Here is how you act out the gospel. It's not always about speaking it, and speaking it is important rather. Speaking it clearly is important, but in this case, live it out. Live it out. Have you heard that quote by St. Francis of Assisi, actually, St. Francis of Assisi, where he's quoted as saying, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Have you heard that? That's actually a misquote. St. Francis of Assisi didn't say that. He actually said the opposite. So the saying is, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. His point when he said this is teaching to some monks, basically. He was actually saying the opposite, rather. He was saying it's necessary to use words when you preach the gospel. And I agree. But I think the point is that we do need to preach the gospel at all times, sometimes by acting like Jesus and believing in people, sometimes like acting like Paul and saying, look, I'll pay the price if somebody that I believe in, if it's a wrong thing and they break something or they steal something, I'll take the risk. I'll take the risk because I believe in this person. And Paul took a risk. It was a huge risk. He didn't know how it was going to turn out. But because it turned out well, then Paul's risk changed history. And Paul's risk affected his own legacy and the legacy of Onesimus. And I believe also the legacy of Philemon. So my question is, have you ever taken a risk on someone else? And if you have taken a risk, how do you decide who to take a risk on? How do you decide who you're going to take a risk on, believe in? Do you only take a risk on people who never make mistakes? That's not a risk. That's not a risk. No. If you're going to take a risk, it's on somebody that maybe has a bad past, but you're believing in them now because they've shown that they're serious. They're serious. They're not playing games anymore. They're serious about following God. Now, people will make mistakes. They'll make mistakes, but the question is, can you still take a risk and invest in their lives? Can you invest emotionally? How many of you know that if you take a risk on somebody and they hurt you emotionally, it's like, it hurts. I'm talking about a broken heart, right? It hurts. It hurts. Can you still invest emotionally? Can you invest time in prayer for them? Can you invest time in conversations? Can you invest second chances? You are what you are because somebody took a risk on you. Why not pass that blessing to somebody else? Who's your Paul? Maybe you need somebody who's further ahead of you spiritually to be your mentor. Or who's your Onesimus? Somebody to whom you can say, others may not believe in you, but I believe in you. Let me finish with this. Getting back to this rich billionaire owner of the Houston Rockets that we started talking about. The chairman of the Board of Regents for University of Houston, who brokered this invitation for the school to join this football conference. He has his own, according to this article, he has his own definition of legacy. He's quoted as saying in the article that legacy, he says, is about power and politics. That's why he got it done. I got the power and I got the politics. He says legacy is about power and politics. I beg to differ. I believe legacy is about humility and service. It's about being humble enough to believe in people and to serve them by taking a risk on changing their legacy. Jesus did it to us. Paul did it. And I believe the baton is in our hands. And so, two things that I want you to remember. Two things. One is we can change our legacy. And not really we, God does that, but when we give our hearts to the Lord, people won't be shaking their heads at our memory. They'll be smiling. When we live for God, when we're surrendered for God, when we don't want our own way all the time, when we want to demand our own way all the time, that's a wrong legacy. But secondly, we can change somebody else's legacy. If we believe in them, and that includes see them, envision them if they're not followers of Christ, as a follower of Christ. Envision them being saved and transformed. Believe in them. Let's do what Jesus did and what Paul taught. Let's bow in prayer. Father, I come to you today, Lord, thankful for the opportunity these past weeks to look at this letter together. I fear that there are portions of the scriptures that we sometimes just pass over very superficially, not really understanding or taking the time to understand the lessons that they have for us. Things that we need to learn right now in our current society, in our current culture. I thank you that your word is alive and it's powerful, that it changes lives, changes our hearts and lives. Lord, I just pray if there's somebody that is listening today, either listening, watching the live stream, or maybe listening later on to the podcast, however they might be hearing my voice, and they understand, they're intelligent enough, they're smart enough, they're humble enough to understand if I die today, my legacy is not going to be all that great, and I want to change things. I pray, dear God, that they would be able to turn to you and ask you to forgive their sins and to change their hearts and transform their lives. Grant it today, Father, and grant us to live for you in a way that impacts the lives of others now and even after we're gone. We surrender to you, Father. Just like you used somebody else to bring us to where we are now, we want to be used of you to bring others to the cross. We pray this in Jesus' name.